Be sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, as Maddie has already introduced me, so my name is Anuj, and I've been helping to run the Radical Info Shop here, which is which has been running since 2004, nearly on and off because of location issue and everything. And as I got involved in the info shop and started reading more, in the beginning I was always just introduced with the Western side of the anarchist history, and I didn't even found it odd that I was just reading anarchist history in Europe and America. Then slowly I started finding more anarchists in Asia, and then started researching on it more. Then suddenly I was like, so where are all the anarchists in Asia? So I was like, need to research. And then I started digging more, and then found out that there is a lot of anarchist history in Asia that we don't know about nearly. But we know, but hasn't been made into like some books or videos or documentaries that would simplify stuff. So yeah, that started my initial idea on like writing the book, because there are specific books on China or Japan or Korea, and they're very not complicated, let's say, but only for intellectuals and academics that would like to read that stuff. It's not simplified, so even normal people can know like, okay, these are the things that happened. So I would like to make it more simplified for people. So so yeah, and I've made a small presentation on it. So like the Asian names are very confusing, even for myself. So for you guys, it will be confusing. So I had to add pictures and names all written on it. But let's see, I have to share my, like, how do I share it? At this presentation, but only host can share it. So, hmm, either way.
Yeah. Participants can share.
Hmm?
I just changed it. You should be able to share it now.
Okay. Mm-hmm. No, no. All this confusion. I was so prepared for to do this in laptop, and now I have to do it in mobile, and I'm like confused
That's all right. If you can always share the slideshow with us later.
now.
You can
So I
just
will just like say things because I have it all sort of memorized, so it's okay.
that's all right. You go for it.
Mm. So I will refer to all the anarchists in their first name only, because then it will be less confusing. So I would like to start with anarchists in Korea, let's say. And so the Korean anarchism is kind of the most controversial and also more radical, because they have been totally nationalistic in their approach. And I think that's one of the main reasons that Western anarchists have ignored the Korean side of the anarchist history, because for them it's considered to be too nationalistic. And I also thought the same before I researched about it. And so it's more, yes, they have a nationalistic history, but they were caught up in a strange time when Korea was occupied by Japan. So, and the main focus of Korean people was independence from Japan. So, like, anarchists couldn't just ignore the social issue and like say like, "Yeah, forget about the imperialists. We need anarchism now because it's not possible. You have to first get independence at least." So yeah, so I would, so the guy who kind of took it to the forefront was Kim Chin. Like, hope I'm pronouncing him right. So Kim Chin was born in December 16, 1989, and he was kind of a very radicalized person since his childhood, and he also freed about 50 slaves by burning the registration of the slaves. So it was kind of like the first modern emancipation of slaves in Korea. And he was also a highly intellectual person and from the high upper class there. So he had all the educations that needed. So he got into radical literature quite early in life, and he got into the limelight after March 1st movement, which is kind of said as the beginning of Korean independence movement. And when he got involved in the March 1st movement, and then the Japanese went after him, so he had to run away to China. And now comes the more complex wave of relationship in Asian anarchism history, because China, Korea, and Japan said a very interlocked relation. It's like a massive wave of like radicals moving around, especially in the beginning of 1900s and before that. So Kim ran away to China, and there he helped establish the Republic of Korea in Shanghai, the exiled republic. And he was also appointed as a general there. So it's already a contradiction because like him being an anarchist working for government as a general, but it was not, it was exiled government. So I see the point why he supported also. And him being the general, he was very good at it. So he mm, he was very helpful on fighting back the Japanese soldiers that were sent on crushing the Korean independent government in exile. But he didn't stay general. Now this is where his true anarchism comes into practice. Because after that battle, where he was the general for the government, he kept on going north towards Manchuria. And Manchuria is like the hotbox of radicalism in Asia. Because like all the Koreans exiles were nearly there, the Chinese anarchists were there, and even the Japanese anarchists were there. And when he moved up to Manchuria, and now the most interesting part in Asian anarchism comes, is they formed the Autonomous Anarchist zone there called KPAM. It was like Korean, um, how do I say it? Korean like autonomous state inside China in Manchuria, but they had their own governments in a sense. And it had 2 million people living under it. And it was totally anarchist. There were no money, no class structure, and it was all mutual aid based. They were very influenced by Kropotkin and his mutual aid work. And the place was Sinmim province. The people just call it Sinmim. So the Sinmim lasted for 3 years. And it was kind of like the only radical experiment in Asia, anarchist experiment in Asia on that big of a scale, I think, because sustaining 2 million people for 3 years is quite a hard job. But then Kim got assassinated there, and that is the falling point for Korean anarchism. Because as soon as he got assassinated, the Japanese army sent armies to crush it, and also the um, Chinese pro-nationalist. They have an interesting part also, which will come later. The Chinese independence supporters from Kunmingtang, which is called KMT, also attacked them, and Shinmin got closed, ended, and there goes the anarchist. It's a, and this is just a brief point also, because like it's more complex than that, because inside Korea itself there were like anarchist groups in nearly every province and producing anarchist articles and everything. And nowadays Korean scholars are also acknowledging it, it seems. And there are a lot of movies being made also, like mainstream movies with anarchists coming there, because like nowadays there's again this hype of how Japan was a douchebag to Korea. So yeah, so Kim Kim was one of the most influential people, but he was in China. Now comes another guy whose name is Park Yul, and Park Yul, he was also involved in the March 1st movement, and this guy has an interesting history because instead of running to China, he ran away to Japan, and in Japan he got very involved with the anarchist movement there and worked with the Japanese anarchists, especially with Kanako Fumiko, who become his lover, and they got involved into a high treason case, which was on plotting to assassinate the Meiji emperor, which is true and false at the same time, because they did wanted to do that, but it wasn't any. They didn't have a solid plan on when to do it or how to do it or anything. And when they got arrested on like different matter, and they got more investigated and everything, and Park Kyu accepted the charges of wanting to assassinate the Meiji emperor, and they got life imprisonment. Oh, later on, life imprisonment. In the beginning, they were given a death sentence, but there was this massive movement inside Japan and Korea for their freedom, and if Park Kyu was executed, he would become a national hero for Korean independence movement. So yeah, it might get too confusing, like this name and history part. I will just go very fast through it. So Park Yu, yeah, so he got pardoned from execution because his death would trigger more rebellion. So it's interesting because Park Yu and Fumiko were in the same group called Futeisa. It's called the outlaws in Japan because like Koreans were regarded as outlaws. And so it's a very and they have a very nice romantic history also. Japanese anarchists, even though they were like very radical, they were also experimenting highly with free love concept. So there's all this, how do you call it, triangle love stories. Let's say like one guy, two girls, and all that stuff, and all anarchists always ending up in jealousy and fighting each other, which is expected. Yeah. So just on a closing for Korean anarchism, so there's Park Kyu who was in Japan, there's Kim who went to China, and Kim ended up getting assassinated there because of the Simnim issue, and Park Kyu got life imprisonment, but he got freed after 25 years, I think, and he went back to Korea. While Fumiko is said to have committed suicide in prison, but it's controversial. People say she was killed. Mm. And thus, it's like the main point here is anarchists were all in Asia, mostly focused on independence, except in Japan, because Japan was the imperialist here. So Koreans were, even though they were working together with Japanese anarchists, they were very much against the Meiji Empire and for independence. It's basically called nationalist and anarchism in a sense by historians. And sadly, it didn't had any fruit because later on, like from the after the Korean War, like the communists took control because the Russian helped the communists and the Americans took the South Korea. So yeah, sad history for anarchists everywhere. And I'll just move to Japan now because like it's called related, but there are some major figures like in Japan the first most prominent figure was Kotoku Susui. Like, I really hate this pronunciation, but yeah. But Kotoku was also from a well-off family and very intelligent person. He was in the beginning more of a socialist, and then he got imprisoned for his works in magazine. He was editing and writing for a lot of magazines, but he wasn't an anarchist. But then he got jailed, and once he came out of the prison, classic story, he was already an anarchist. Sorry. Mm, so prison helped him because in the prison he somehow got a Bakunin and Kropotkin, which is very interesting because it's in the same time. Kotoku was alive when Kropotkin was alive. And even though there was no internet back then, like Kropotkin's work were already circulating all around the world. And when he got out of prison, he was nearly a devout anarchist. And then he later on moved to America, and there he started direct correspondence with Kropotkin and met people from IWW and helped establish Japanese anarchist group in Japan, which were first to threaten the emperor by his direct name, and it was considered very impolite by the emperor. Yeah, like, how dare you call by my name? So yeah, Koduk, and he stayed in California for some time. Then Kotugu came back, and when he came back, he was welcomed by a really big crowd. But but the socialist sides were not expecting that he would come back calling for direct action and revolution in an anarchist fashion. So socialists were quite um, not happy with him, while the youths mostly and the poor and the working class were like happy about it. They supported Kotoku, and he had a huge following. And there's this two group Korean Federation of Labor Union. Those were the two main groups in Japan that had a lot of influence, and on its prime height, there were, I think, more than 40,000 members, which is quite big. Uh, but even though anarchists had quite a big amount of supporters, the Meiji Empire was very much focused on having a centralized state with overseas empire, which included Korea and China. They really wanted to take it. So they were like very focused on destroying the anarchist movement. So Kotoku got charged on high treason. Again, like most of the anarchists in Japan. Like, he got charged on high treason because some anarchists were found with explosive making materials. Even though Kotuko was not involved, he got executed. So that ended the life of the most prominent anarchists, but it didn't end the movement because there were a lot of very radical anarchists, and among them was Osugi. Osugi was also very much of a anarchist individualist. So it is very important to note that even though Japanese anarchism was anti-imperialist, it was also um, very lifestyle oriented also, because for them it was also living it every day. So, and Osugi is a very controversial figure because he was the main guy who practiced the concept of free love. He he was married, but because he was very much of an egoist, influenced by Max Turner. Also, there were a couple of individualists who were influenced by Max Turner in the early 1900s in Japan, which I found very interesting because, like, Turner in Japan, in 1900s, like when Japan was more of a Confucian society, was very contradictory. So Osugi, being an egoist and individualist, wanted to experiment with free love as well. So even though having a wife, he started having relationships with two prominent, high-profile feminists, and it worked for a time also because Kotoku and Noi Ito, and also Ichigo. Like Noi Ito and Ichigo were two prominent feminists. Do not make you guys confused with the names. And they were both working on, I think, the first feminist magazine in Japan called Blue Stocking. It was very controversial, this magazine. They were supporting like prostitution, abortion, free love, and they were a lot of times getting censored. But going back to free love again. So Osugi, having a wife, started affair with two prominent feminists, while Noi Ito was also an anarchist. But then they practiced it for a while, but there started a big amount of jealousy among them. And so Ichigo ended up stabbing Osuki on the neck one day out of jealousy. So she ended up in prison. It was like very controversial news in the society and has been made into movies and stories in popular culture. There's also a very fantastic movie on it called Aerosplash Massacre. If you guys haven't watched it, it might be one of the best movie on anarchism that came out from Asia, which I have managed to watch or found. But Osugi was not just into free love because he would have been charged with high treason with Kotoku, but Osugi was already in prison when that happened, so he survived it. But sadly, after this tsunami of oh shit, I forgot the time. Okay. But during the early 1900s, there was a big tsunami in Japan, and it and the government took advantage of it also. So around that time, a lot of anarchists were rounded up, including him. But even then, he survived. But later on, Itonoi and Osugi and their cousin were wrongfully killed by police, beaten up, tortured, and thrown into well. And it was not accepted by the society. It kind of makes sense that Japanese people were also supporting of anarchism because they were like offended by it because it was not a justified killing because even their 6-year-old nephew was killed with them. So the police who was involved on it, the lieutenant, was jailed for 10 years, but he came out quite soon. Like the Japanese anarchism is, I think, the most cultivated in Asia, even though they didn't manage to like have a prominent autonomous state or anything, but they were the ones who circulated the idea because like people from China were coming to study in Japan, and people from Korea were coming to study in Japan, and Tokyo became like Manchuria, hotbed for radical. And talking about high treason, like just going back to the anarchist who I called Bakul. So as Bakul was also in high treason, his girlfriend, sorry, not say girlfriend, wife, Kaneko Fumiko, who was a Japanese who committed suicide, let's say, wrote a very touching novel, or let's say her biography, called The Prison Memoirs of a Japanese Woman. It was not that well accepted because it was very, I think it went very underground, the circulation of this stuff. It didn't reach the radical culture very early, so it remained hidden. And only nowadays, like the book is like a little bit focused by academics, and it's a fantastic book. Like it shows the life the Japanese people were living, especially the poor Japanese people, and especially the life of a woman in Japan who was subjugated very much. And she even was sent to Korea to live with her grandmother, I think. And so she saw the injustice that Korean people were suffering from Japan as well. So she became very vocal against it. But in the beginning, she was more of a Christian because the anarchist literature didn't reach her first. First, she was helped by Christian preachers in Tokyo, so she was involved in Christianity first, then she met some socialists, then she became socialist, and then finally she met some anarchists, and then she became an anarchist and read this poem by Park Yu called The Mad Dog in Anarchist magazine, and started searching for him and found him and slowly started the relationship. So it's a fantastic story. I love Japanese anarchism because it has this love and revolution kind of concept. But Japanese anarchism was nearly destroyed by the end of World War II because they were fighting on all fronts. So Japanese government, first of all, wanted to kill them all. And then Japan was already invaded by Americans who didn't like anarchists at all, the Red Terror. And so, yeah, anarchism in Asia didn't manage to survive the two wars that because in Korea also it didn't survive, especially after it got divided into South and North and Communist and Democrat. It was a tricky situation. And in China, which I'm getting at after this, didn't have it. Also, because the communists came into power with the help of anarchists, by the way. It's a very interesting point. Nearly killed or exiled all of them. So, okay then. I stop with the Japanese thing here because the history never ends in my head. So I'll move on to the Chinese side of the Asian history. So in China also, just like Korea, anarchists were highly involved with the nationalist movement and thus quite ignored by the rest of the world as the anarchist history. How can they be anarchists when they were nationalists? So, so I would start with Si Fu, very, very like common name in a sense. I think in the movie genre of Chinese, like it's like sounds like already a Shaolin master or something. Si Fu, but he wasn't Shaolin master; he was anarchist, right? So I'll start with Si Fu, who was born in 1984, and and he was also from a well-off family. It seems all the anarchists are from the well-off family mostly because then you get to get educated and then finally agitate. So Shifu, who got well of education and everything, was very much frustrated with the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty, even though it didn't survive long, had played a very tricky plot in China. And which is very in detail, so I don't want to get there. But so Shifu was against the Qing dynasty, first get into radicalism by joining the Chinese Assassination Corps, which is quite sounds scary also. But those were all mostly fueled by nationalists and anarchists. And Chinese history is full of secret organization and assassination corps. Uh, so yeah, he joined the Chinese Assassination Corps, but which was highly influenced by Russian nihilism and the propaganda of the day. So when Sifu joined it and got involved with them, he was very much uh, he got disillusioned by them. He didn't find it fruitful to just assassinate or bomb people. So he slowly left the group and went into organizing the poor people and the farmers and the peasants and advocated what he called true socialism, which was anarchism. So Sifu can be regarded as uh, somewhat of a pure anarchist in China, who was not much involved with the nationalist pursuit. Because as I will move on, the Chinese anarchists were like highly supporting of Kuomintang, the KMT, which will later on, as I said, will attack the Shin Korean Autonomous Anarchist side. But yeah, going back to Sifu again. Sifu, after he left the corp, founded Society of Cocks Crowing in the Dark. So yeah, it makes total sense for Chinese people, because, but for Western people, it will sound funny. So, and in short form, it was called Cock Crow Society, and they had their own magazine, and which was the most uh, important, let's say, group in China that promoted true socialism. But he had his up and downs a lot, because China was just full of uphills. Uh, yeah, so I'll just move to another guy. I don't want to get lost in my head. Uh, so another guy is Li Sheng. So Li Sheng is the one who can be, I would say, not totally, but who can be said to be the person who helped bring anarchism plus communism in China, because Li Sheng went to Paris. So here comes the anarchist history of China, which is divided into two parts, which is the Paris anarchists and the Chinese anarchists who were in China, Shanghai, Manchu. So yeah, so Li Sheng, as he was also from a high society and family, so he got to travel to Paris on official terms, official business, let's say. But then he started studying there, but like I think it was biology and chemistry, and he was kind of more getting in love with science. And when he was studying in Paris or everything, he got more introduced to works of Kropotkin and Reclus, and he was highly influenced by their scientific approach to anarchism. So Li Shen being very influenced by Kropotkin and Reclus and then Bakunin, Proudhon, started making, made the organization there called World Society in 1906, which was an anarchist society, but would later on not be one, but I don't want to get there. So World Society plays a very important part because from World Society, they started making programs that would bring Chinese students to Paris, and which was their plan to convert them to anarchism. So they were trying really hard to take as much as Chinese people to Paris so they would get introduced to new science, the more bigger world, and anarchism. So, so they took a lot of people from China. And even Mao wanted to go to France. And he was also influenced by anarchists in the beginning because, like, in the beginning, China had a very big anarchist circle before communism came. So Mao was already very familiar with anarchism. But Mao didn't got to go to Paris. I don't know if we should be thankful for it or be sad about it. If he had gone to Paris, maybe he would have become an anarchist. But, so he didn't get to go there. But a lot of Chinese did, and which brought in a lot of anarchism to China. But their even more contribution was a magazine called Xing Shiji. Like my pronunciation is totally off, but in English it's called New Era or New Century. And that magazine was extremely focused on anarchism, which was based in Paris. And that magazine called New Era helped circulate anarchism to radical Chinese all over the world. But it didn't get into China much because it was quite censored still. But more rest of the Chinese were in Japan or like America or Europe, got to read it. And they were always in high dispute with nationalists or religious people because they were anti-tradition, anti-religion, anti-smoking, anti-gambling, anti-prostitution. So joining an anarchist Chinese group was nearly like joining a religious group because you were banned from doing nearly most of everything that people do, like except sex. You were not allowed to drink or smoke or prostitution or gambling. You have to be fit. You have to study. You have to exercise. And they were anti-Taoism. They didn't consider Lao Tzu as an anarchist, which is interesting. But I understand that too. It is understandable. Like from if someone says one of the Hindu gurus, there are thousands of them, and all of them have near anarchist principles. Not totally, but a lot of them have nearly anarchistic preaching. But they are not anarchists, and if people start calling them anarchists, I would be like, not much, but it is understandable. But Li Xing uh, made that society there. Okay, then. So if we are getting into closing time, I would just add one last guy from India. So the Indian guy was Bhagat Singh, and Bhagat Singh, like Indian, like anarchism in India is totally foreign thing. Because people don't have any idea, any notion that anarchists were in India. But Bhagat Singh, who is the most famous revolutionary in India, was an anarchist and a member of Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, and he even bombed the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi, but without the intention of killing everyone, just like a dramatic show to bring up attraction. And his whole point was to take him to court and and to use the court hearing as propaganda. But he knew he would be killed if he did that, and he ended up being hanged because of it. He was an atheist and a highly read anarchist. He was influenced by Bakunin and propaganda of the deed and direct action. Yeah. So I have this presentation which I will send to Maddie also, and I could also write a short summarized essay on it if anybody would like to read it further. Yeah, and as it's too much complicated history, so I will keep on talking. So, yeah, so questions?
So we have our first question is from Sophia. Did you want to ask the question or do you want me to read it out?
Like you can read it out.
Yeah, I just she wants to ask.
Or she can ask.
It's from Casey.
Hey, Casey.
Hey.
How is rural life in Nepal applicable as anarchism as a practice?
If we consider mutual aid, then yes, it's because the government is barely existing there. The people are all focused on mutual aid and solidarity. But if we look outside of that, it's also highly religious and patriarchal and sexist. So yeah, it is 30% anarchist and 70% not anarchist.
All right, next we have a question from James.
Yeah, hi. It's pretty simple. I was just wondering if you'd ever found an online resource of that New Era magazine, the Chinese anarchists living in France that you mentioned.
But yeah, I've been searching for that too, but I couldn't find it yet. I've found some pictures of it online, but not much. Like I've been really searching for it. Yeah.
I just Googled it then, and all I got was a lot of pictures of Xi Jinping.
Yeah. Yeah, but that magazine circulated a lot. New Era magazine, from what I read. But like, I'm sure it has been archived somewhere, but it's not online much.
Mm.
Okay, next question is from Mitch.
Hey, I just wanted to quickly ask how you spell the name of that autonomous zone in Manchuria you were talking about.
In Manchuria,
I think you
it
said
is
when you,
called it's Korean People Association in Manchuria.
Can you please repeat that? You froze up a bit.
It's Manchuria. KPAM, and it's
Okay,
in Sinmim province.
thanks. And I also just wanted to ask if you knew more about like the history of anarchism in Nepal, or if you had anything to say about that.
Nepal didn't have an anarchist history, sadly. It was nearly in a dark age uh, until 1800s, in a sense, because we had our own dictatorship, which was by Ranas, and which cut off most of our education and everything. So most of our radicals went to India, and as India also didn't have much of an anarchist history, it had um, more of a communist history. So communism came from India to Nepal, and then communist revolution happened instead of anarchy.
I had a question for you. What effect do you think a nationalistic anarchist movement has had on anarchist history and culture in general?
Sorry, I can't hear you, Maddie.
So, what effect do you think a nationalistic anarchist movement has had on anarchist history and the culture in general?
Like what effect it has happened? Um, the like nationalist movement kind of like shadowed the main principle of anarchism, let's say, because of which rest of the world didn't figure it out. I think because like unlike the anarchists in Spain, GNTFAI, the Japanese associations work in a similar way, but it's not recognized, and neither the Korean anarchists, who even though were like very hardcore anarchists, they never diverted from the anarchist principle, but had to help get their country free from Japanese imperialism. Them just getting involved with nationalism shadowed the core principle and thus not recognized, I think. And it's quite sad also because I find it really, really interesting the more deeper I go. It's far more interesting than Star Wars.
Is that something that you're going to touch on or research with your book?
Yeah, like my main focus would be to say that all the anarchist history in Asia were relevant and most of them were anarchists because like just because they had to support nationalism in their process doesn't make them not anarchists. Like even in Emma Goldman biography, there is this part where she meets an Indian anarchist and he calls for support and stuff from Emma Goldman and she talks with him, but then she ignores him as being too nationalistic, even though he did call himself an anarchist. So this, I think, is a very like not a major issue, but very prominent one in the West and East anarchism. And plus, even in No God, No Master, which is a very highly read book in anarchism, there are no mention of anarchists in Asia, nor females anarchists. And even in the documentary in No God, No Master, they have even misplaced the image. Like they have placed the picture of Manchurian anarchist region with Chinese anarchists. So I was like, what the fuck? You know, like, so it kind of shows that people, like intellectuals in Western part, are kind of slacking off on their research in Asian history, especially radical Asian history.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that Asia has been ignored collectively, like talking about Asia as a whole, and like, why do you think it's been ignored so much?
Sorry, could you repeat that? It's very low.
Sorry, why do you
Your
think
sound.
it's been ignored so much, like anarchists in Asia?
Mm, like there can be a lot of factors. Like I said, like nationalism shadowed it, and plus it's also because of imperialism. I say because Asian people were kind of looked at as uneducated, lagging far behind in industrial science or anything. And plus, it's hard for, I think, like those bourgeois intellectuals to look at peasants and farmers in Asia and think that they have a radical anarchist ideology in them. Because for them, it's kind of hard to imagine that. Like they only think you need to have a proper education or PhD or something before you get a glimpse of anarchism. But peasants here lived it in a sense, especially in China, Korea. Did I get the point? I don't know what did I say just now.
That is. And I have another question. Do you think that the lack of written history about anarchism in Asia has prevented or slowed down any sort of movement of anarchists in Asian countries?
Most probably, most probably.
Why so?
But because like even though the anarchists themselves were defeated and they had to go underground and they are still there. Like there are still anarchists in Korea, there are still anarchists in Japan, and there are still anarchists in China. But even though in China it's very well hidden, um, that how do I say it? But if there was a nice acceptance and big documentaries and books and shows about it that were watched by people worldwide, it would most probably influence more youths here for sure. Because like Asians have always been going after the West. Like everything West, we like it, and that's the history in a sense. Like Asia has been trying to copy the scientific advancement in the West along with its culture. Like most of the Chinese who were in Paris, were became very Francophiles, let's say, or Frencophiles, what they call it. Like they were obsessed with everything France. They even have goatee and like even they dressed like French people. So if uh, anarchism in Asia was regarded and read and valued in the West, then Eastern people would have definitely been more psyched on it. But I wouldn't say it's just the reason. Like documentaries have, just like what was it? The forget it. Like it would definitely help, but it wouldn't bring about a big change for sure.
Well, we have a comment from James.
Yeah, I'm kind of going backwards to what you were talking about just before, but Joe Hill of the IWW in America was very, very interested in Chinese, Chinese culture, Chinese behaviors, and even mirrored some of the what you were talking of like joining a religion. They couldn't drink, no smoking, all of
Yeah,
these like sort of strict, like yeah, like I mean, religious sort of behaviors. Yeah, so that's just an interesting thing that seems a parallel.
Yeah, like
I think maybe
Chinese.
bourgeois intellectuals have erased, but maybe not so much on a grassroots level.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
because Chinese and Japanese were also involved in IWW.
Yeah.
They're their own organization. I think the Chinese also helped in the Zapatista revolution. So yeah, they were quite
Absolutely.
there.
So they very likely would have fought side by side there, right?
Yeah, I don't think there was a huge amount of Chinese in the Mexican Revolution, but there were.
A couple, yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
I mean, there's also a Japanese surrealist group from, I think, around the 30s that would have been tied to French surrealism. I don't know if you've come across that at all.
like with the situationist, you mean, or no?
I mean, it's a precursor to the Situationists in many ways, but Andre
Way
Breton
forward.
and
I think you both just
fuck.
froze. So what was that? It was a precursor to the Situationist.
You
Now
want
this is
your?
the
I think I've lost mine. Yeah.
situation.
Okay, well, Anuj, did you have any last sort of final comments that you wanted to make, or sort of any ideas or topics or stuff that you sort of suggest that we can go and read after this to go and have a better understanding of anarchists in Asia? Anuj, you're muted. There you go.
So
Yeah, what were your last comments? Oh, what were your last comments for us?
last comments.
Yeah. So, is there anything that you think that we should go and read, or
Oh yeah,
groups and stuff that we should look at?
like you guys would definitely read on the Korean Autonomous region in Manchuria, and also like I really love the book of written by Kaneko Fumiko, The Prison of Memoirs of a Japanese Woman. That would that book will give a very nice, clear example of the social situation there, which made the anarchists who they were, both in Korea and Japan, because she lived half her life in Japan and half her life in Korea. So those two things are very influential.
And
And plus, there is
that book available just online? Like you can just get the PDF?
yes,
Okay.
I think it's in the anarchist library.
Cool.
Mm.
So why do you think it's important that we go and read those?
Because, like I said, it clearly portrays the socio-economic situation, and also on the woman's side, like how misogynist and sexist the society was back then.
Wonderful.
And there's this book. Wait, uh, how do I say it? Can you say it?
Chinese anarchist movie? Yeah. The zine. Where's that from?
This book was made in uh, Berkeley Center for Chinese Studies, 1961.
Are you seeing these messages on the chat as well?
Yep, I've been seeing them.
Yeah. Is that right, from Sean?
Sorry?
Is that last message from Sean, is that the same zine pamphlet? Sorry.
Saw it for a little while.
Sick. All right. Well, I am going to send in.
There's this book also, which
yeah.
is really nice. Which is by John Crump. The Anarchist Movement in Japan by John Crump.
And hey, Anuj, did you say that Japanese movie, was that called Aerosplash Massacre?
Yes.
Okay.
Super nice.
I have a copy of that, and I can share it with anyone who wants a copy. If you just send me a message or something, anyone in the chat.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anuj, for coming
that-
on today. And thank you so much for talking and everything. If you send me the slides that you had made for us today, I will include them in the recording with this video. Everyone, if you look at the chat, you can see that I've sent in the link for the fundraiser. We're going to try and raise some money for the next month or so as well. We've got a fundraiser going in Nepal, and we have a fundraiser going on in France as well. And the money is pretty much just going to make sure that Anuj can continue on the info shop. He just needs to be able to pay rent, maybe get some more books, and just pretty much continue doing what he does. He also wants to start putting on more events, so Zoom events as well. So hopefully when he can start doing that, maybe I can share that along with all of you as well, and we can join in with Nepalese talks too. So I'll leave that in the chat, and I'll share it along with the recording of this video as well. But thank you so much, everyone. I'll unmute you if you want to.
Yay!
To a nudge. So you can all be unmuted.
Hope you guys didn't get bored or confused by my mumbling.
Not at all. It was fantastic. Thank
Yeah,
you
it was
so
great.
Thanks, Anuj.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Anuj.
Thanks, Anuj.
I'm blushing now.
Thanks, Anuj.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you guys again.
Okay.
Such a big family.
Tracy and Maddie's mum. And Dad.
Okay.
And Jack.
Is that a cat?
Where? Oh yeah, that's a cat.
Is it a?
It's a black cat.
I thought that was a blanket. Jimmy.
That's huge.
That's a middle-class grey bourgeois cat.
Oh.